The part that has been important is for the last couple of months, I've been able to take time off everything else or most everything else to be able to focus on the book, which is what I actually needed. And instead of all the distractions with dealing with people who literally were making videos, telling people not to donate to me or attacking my character, now I don't have to worry about that. So it's been very good to be able to do that. I'm now on chapter 3 in terms of the rewrite. So again, I've already written 12 chapters, but I have to rewrite them. So I'm in the process of doing that. And my hope is by the end of next month, I'm going to be at least 4 or 5. So chapter 5 next month. And the reason why that's important is because the first 4 sections of the book are going to be the critical ones. And some of you have heard me talk about it before in terms of conversations with myself, with others, that kind of element. And I realized about 2 months ago or so that was getting really convoluted. So part of the editing down process is actually making sure that I can take away some of the busyness of it and really zero in on what needs to be said. And that's why I'm rewriting this section, because I've been finding it's actually a lot easier when I actually focus on the key principles that I think we need to be able to teach for conversations on LGBTQ with those people who are not believers, or even people who are believers but may not be friendly to our worldview. And so that's now the first 4 sections of the book. And that's what I want to be able to share with you. And these 4 sections are ones you'll hear me share throughout, both in our ministry and other places. But I'll lay out clearly why I think these 4 principles are critical in the book and why it's important for us to come back and know these principles well in order to have conversations that are effective on LGBTQ issues. That's why it's so critical, I think, to have this book done, to get it out there, because I think these are foundational principles for this topic particularly, but also you'll see you can learn from these 4 principles in other difficult conversations, especially in the light of what's going on. So some of you might have seen the controversy around the Olympic Games introduction. I was actually wanting to write about it, but I'm writing my book. So part of what's happening is the conversations have been around the opening game ceremonies, whether it mocked the Lord's Supper, whether it mocked Jesus, because they had all these drag show performers around what looked like a Christ-like figure around a table, looking like the Da Vinci painting on the Lord's Supper. What's been happening for those of you who've been following it on social media and other places, there's actually been Christians now who are defending this act, or at least by saying we are too focused and too easily offended. This was not mocking Da Vinci or the Lord's Supper. This was mocking or setting up a painting from ancient pagan times with Dionysus, the god of wine and alcohol and debauchery. And so Christians are way too sensitive. That's part of the conversation. And again, it's touching on these LGBTQ questions. Now, I think the opening game ceremonies themselves were problematic for many reasons, not just the least of which is making fun of Christ, even if that wasn't their intention. And in fact, the Dionysus religion, I think, is a counterfeit that parades itself against Christ as it is. And I think the pagans of ancient Rome would be proud of that kind of debauchery because it's something that they would use to attack Christianity as well. And there's a lot more to it than that. But in fact, the opening ceremonies also celebrated 2 pro-abortion politicians who helped legalize abortion. They had a man who was walking around as a ballerina, and apparently there was a rip in his outfit, and part of his genitals were showing, like in front of at least one little kid, and in front of billions of people around the world. So this is not something that I think is helpful to show unity, as what the Olympic game organizers claimed. But more importantly, I think this is an opportunity for us as Christians now to say, well, how do we respond? What is it that we need to be able to say? So when we ask that question, I think this leads to the four principles that I think it's important for us to understand when dealing with these kinds of controversies, especially around the LGBTQ questions. Because at the heart of what the organizer, who is an openly gay man, by the way, the art director for the program of the Olympic Games opening, said was he wanted this to be a welcoming games that showed that everyone could participate in the games and everyone could participate and enjoy the opening ceremonies, which contradicts the message of what he was doing in creating that kind of opening ceremony. So that leads to I think four key principles helping us understand the controversy and these conversations. And the first principle is that when it comes to sexual identity and gender identity, we may not choose our sexual attractions, but we choose our identity. We may not choose our sexual or gender identity in terms of our how we feel about our gender, but we can choose to make those feelings our identity. And that's an important truth in this conversation, even with the Olympics, because what we're actually seeing is people saying, well, we have to welcome the LGBTQ community. And my response is, sure, we should welcome everybody. We should make fun of anybody, of course, just like what we're saying with what the Olympics should have done. But the assumption in that argument is that the LGBTQ community is a group of people, a category of human being that has to be treated like other categories of human being based on race or gender or sex or occupation or nationality. And again, I'm not saying we mistreat anyone or we try to take away from the fact that they have a community that they've built around their sexual orientation. But the argument that I'm making is that at the end of the day, you choose to make your sexual attractions the core of your identity. And if that's the case, that's your right, but I don't have to agree with that. I don't have to agree that that's a good form or foundation for your identity. And once we begin to understand this, we actually begin to understand why it's so hard for the LGBTQ community to have the conversations with the Christian community, because what they see is at the core of it, their sexual attractions define them. And as Christians, we realize no, our sexuality is not what defines us. What defines us is our Creator. He's the one who decides who we are. And I think that's such a liberating thing, not only for me personally, having to deal with these feelings and saying, no, these feelings don't define me, but also when I talk to young people, because intuitively, I think most young people see that, and especially those who've grown up in the last 20 years, that they don't always feel one sexual identity or another. Their sexual feelings do change, their gender feelings do change. Hopefully, we'll get a chance to interview someone who has left the transgender identity behind, and she'll share her own personal story dealing with how these feelings have now changed in her life. Right. So, this is the first point. Sexuality, sexual attractions may not be a choice, but your identity is. And we'll unpackage that more in one of the upcoming YouTube lives. The second point, and I think this is also an important one for us to understand in light of this controversy with the Olympics, is that love is not love, God is love. Love is not love, but God is love. And what does that mean? Well, we use the word love is love, which I've taught my youth this word. It's a tautology. And in philosophy, that means it's a word that is defined by itself. And that's not really a definition. Like water is wet, right? Or blue is blue, right? That's the kind of we no, that's not how we should define those words, because those words are not actually definition. Whereas if we actually want to understand what love is, we need to look at the character of Christ, of God Himself. And we begin to see that what Jesus offers in Scripture about what love looks like is far different than what our culture is offering when it comes to love. And this is critical for conversation training, even in the Olympics, because what's happening is the people promoting a non-biblical worldview think they're actually being loving, and because they're being tolerant and they're welcoming everybody, even if they don't welcome Christians. And that's how lost some of them are. But this is the point. We need to show a better way to love. And that's the second principle that's key. For those of you who heard my videos before, this is also where we need to understand God expresses his love in at least four different ways through four different kinds of relationships that humans need. Right? And this love includes storge love, which is family love, which is why God says we are his children and he is our father. Through philia love, right? Jesus calls the disciple his friends. You're no longer my servants, you're my friends. Filial love is a critical element to all of us because it's the kind of love we would have with people who are our peers, people who are like us. Same sex friendship is a good thing. Jesus even had that. The problem is we have lost that ability to experience same sex friendship if we all call all loves the same kind of love. Thirdly is eros love, romantic love, or C.S. Lewis says passion love. And what's important about passion love is Paul even describes the love of Jesus to the church and compares that with the love of a husband to his wife. And this is such a powerful thing to remember because God is not against sexuality. We need to teach that in these conversations, but we need to show that God's love is better. His offer, his design is better for sexuality when we talk about the kind of romantic or eros love that he has given us to need. And in the conversation with the Olympics, this is simply saying, and this is what we need to be able to go back to our friends who are pushing this to say, look, you have a choice as adults to express your sexuality however you want within reason. You can't rape people. You can't have sex with children. And we all agree that those are bad things. But don't we realize if there's a designer who designed sexuality, then shouldn't we love the way he's designed us to express ourselves the way he knows best? And that's through marriage between one man, one genetic male, one genetic female for one lifetime. Those are the people who are most sexually satisfied because that's the way God designed it. And the last love, of course, is agape love or unconditional love or God love. And this is why it's so critical for us as Christians to be able to convey that when it comes to love, we cannot even begin to understand what love is unless we know Jesus first. Love comes from God, scripture says. And this is such a wonderful thing to be able to convey to those around us. We actually do know what love looks like. We can live out what love is because we can see what God is doing. Now, as a little caveat, there's some Christians out there saying, oh, there's overreaction against Olympics. We're actually acting mean and rude. And yeah, we shouldn't be mean or rude. That's not what I'm saying. But what they've actually started to say is Jesus would never have been angry, or Jesus would never have corrected, or Jesus would never have pushed back, and he would have seen, these are non-Christians, so we should be able to treat them like that way. Don't expect them to act like Christians. Sure, and those are all legitimate points, okay? I'm not suggesting that's not the case. Here's the problem. The organizers of the Olympics said the opening games, and the art designer himself said the opening games are supposed to be welcoming to everybody. But if they create something that isn't welcoming to Christians, what they're actually saying is you Christians no longer belong in the public arena. You're not part of the everybody. And I think as Christians in democratic countries, we have a right to say that's not true, and we have a right to speak out and to say, no, we have a right to be part of this. This should be a place where everybody's welcome and no one should be offended unnecessarily. Just think about it. Beijing had the Olympics a few years ago. And there's a lot of concerns that Beijing would promote communist ideals in their Olympics, and they didn't do that. But we would be quite upset if they did, right? Because that would be imposing and unwelcoming, imposing their worldview and unwelcoming to everybody else. Well, didn't France do the same thing by doing this, right? It's just as problematic. The third, and this was probably the most personal thing to write for me, in terms of principles on sexuality and gender, is that when it comes to masculinity or femininity, these are not destinations for us to arrive at, but a description that God has already given to us. And there's so many gender confused kids out there who really feel that masculinity or femininity is something they could never achieve. They could never reach out. And when I was about 13 years old, I was singing alto, which is the female low tone in choir, because my voice was so high. I didn't feel very masculine sitting in choir, but I love singing. I still do. And part of my desire to feel masculine or to be manly was to be something that I wasn't. And I have learn, and what God has reminded me, no, it's God who determines what masculine and feminine is. He actually gives that to us at our conception, at fertilization. And we have a right to claim that because we're both male or female made in God's image. And I think that is such a life giving truth that we need to convey to this next generation to help them understand what we're fighting for is not to impose a stereotype on you, but to help you realize the word masculine includes all boys and the word feminine includes all girls. And this is such an important truth. I think it's life giving. And I gave some pieces of advice in the book that you'll have to read later on about how to use these simple truths to help your church, youth group, your Sunday school class, the Christian kids at your Christian school to really understand that. Because in our culture right now, what they're trying to do is erase the natural differences between male and female. And I think as Christians, we need to celebrate those differences, encourage those differences, and remind people that God is glorified when his image, we are image bearers of God as male or female. And God is glorified when we allow that image to flourish and to be shown to the whole world. We should never disparage either sex because it's so critical that both are necessary in creation. And we should celebrate each child, however way they want to express male or female, to know that they are male or female. They don't have to find it in something else. It's not a destination, it's a description. The last key principle that's important, again, each of these principles I'll expand in the book and talk more about in upcoming sessions if this YouTube format is popular, or if you're interested, again, just email or message us. But in terms of the last point, and this is, I think, one of the key lessons that I've had to learn struggling with this myself, is that all of God's commands are good for us. All of God's commands are good for us. We don't have to not trust him. We don't have to think we know better than him. God knows what's best for us. And when we begin to see the scriptures through that lens, that God has a perfect plan, God always knows what's best. And those rules about sexuality or gender are there for our benefit. So theologically, this is important because there are elements of the church that are now pushing, or at least they claim to be elements of the church, that are pushing to make the church pro LGBTQ. Okay, so this is the chapter that I'll be dealing with that issue and really showing that the culture around us is pushing for something that is less loving. It's less compassionate. It's less morally good when we abandon the good commands of God. And we need to use that idea in our conversations because the argument we give often as apologists, and I love being an apologist, is intellectual, it's reasonable, it's rational, and that's necessary. But we also need to transition to show that the rational arguments we give are also showing the moral goodness of God's created order. Right? So we should not, if we want to be loving and compassionate, we should not abandon God's word. Okay, so those are the four key principles. Again, we'll expand on that as we go, and then there's obviously in the chapters in the book, we'll cover that. But I want to get to actually reading the sections of the book. What I'd like to do is get this open right now, so give me a few minutes here. I want to make sure that I'm not getting any other emails, making sure no one has other questions here. Okay, so far so good, good. And again, you're welcome to channel or contact us and contact me directly at info@redeemingconversations.ca for those of you who've just joined us so that you can ask questions as well. If you want to join our prayer team, also email that same email. We're going to have a prayer meeting right after this as well. So what I'm going to do, and this is going to be about 3 pages or so. This is the introduction for the book. So this is where I want to lay out what the book is going to be about. But I'm a storyteller, so hopefully that's okay. I'm going to start with a story. And this is the story that will introduce the 4 principles that I have just laid out. Okay. So again, this is how I want to start the book. And the book is called Redeeming Conversations, a Christian handbook on how to talk about identity, love, sexuality, and gender identity. Again, that's the working title. Once I have the second draft finished, I'm going to be sending it to the editor to look at and the book publisher, and they'll be able to get their edits in it as well. Okay, so the introduction. A youth pastor at a small rural church had done a great job reaching out to the local community. Many unchurched youth had joined his group, and some had even become Christians. They were so keen to follow Christ that they began volunteering at the church to teach others about Jesus. But like many of their age, these teens were coming to the church with questions about sexuality and gender identity that the church leadership could not answer. The youth pastor's wife told me she didn't even know what a pansexual was until one of these community students came out as one. The problem was the student was already volunteering with the church Sunday school. Only then did the youth pastor's wife find out that a pansexual is someone who identifies as being sexually attracted to anyone, regardless of their sexual or gender identity. This announcement created a problem for the church leadership, who had to decide whether to let the student keep her job. It was one of the reasons I was invited to speak to their group. When I was invited to do the presentation, the youth pastor told me to prepare for a tough conversation with the students. He warned me that he wasn't sure how they were going to react. As a Christian apologist, we train Christians to be ready for tough conversations about faith and issues that matter to God. I even started the ministry I work for, Redeeming Conversations, to help Christians focus on communicating the gospel clearly to our culture, particularly on difficult issues like sexuality and gender. But even my background in media and public speaking didn't prepare me for what I faced at that church. My problem was twofold. First, this was the first presentation I had done on sexuality. I had avoided the topic, feeling the culture was already too far gone for me to make any difference. In fact, my visit to this church was on the day after the landmark U.S. Supreme Court decision legalizing same sex marriage in that country. The Obergefell decision, 2015, mandated that all states, even those that had laws upholding the unique role of opposite sex marriage, must issue wedding licenses for same sex couples. It was a devastating blow for those of us who support the biblical view of marriage. In Canada, our federal government had legalized same sex marriage 10 years earlier, and the consequences of that decision are still being felt today. Court rulings and government regulations, such as bans against so called conversion therapy, continue to limit what Christians can do to show Christ's love to others. I also avoided talking about the issue because it meant confronting my own same-sex attractions. Though I never actually acted out on these feelings, and I'm glad to say I'm still single and chaste, I never wanted to publicly talk about these attractions. As a pastor's kid who grew up in the church, I was always proud of my boring testimony. I led the church youth group and tried imperfectly to model how to always live rightly with God. In fact, my passion for biblical truth led me to become a professional apologist. A Christian apologist defends the biblical worldview and explains why Christ's teachings are worth believing in. As part of my work, I would often encourage my audiences to put aside their feelings and to look at facts and truth. And if I was honest, I had to admit that was the very thing I was doing with my own same sex attractions. I hope that meant I didn't need to think about those issues. But this was a defining moment. My presentation that day reminded me that there was so much more at stake than my own testimony. That night, my talk on sexuality included a challenge to the students to think about what God's love means. I said his love does not just give us license to do whatever we wish. Rather, I challenged the students to consider that just like a good parent, a loving God gives us rules to live by because he knows what is best for us. In light of that love, I asked the students to trust God's design for sexuality. I pointed out that sexual attractions are things we have, but they do not have to define us. They do not have to be the core of our identity. I then braced myself for challenges during the Q&A, but instead of hostility, I only received friendly responses. The students asked thoughtful questions that allowed me to give them more reasons to trust God's design for sex. Even the pansexual student came to me to talk about the presentation. She thanked me for giving her something to think about because what I said made sense to her. A few minutes later, a second young woman came to chat, often looking down. I knew she was struggling to talk, but she wanted me to know her story too. She was not raised in a Christian home and found the church through the youth ministry. Though she loved the community, she also wanted me to know that she found herself caring deeply for another girl. She wondered why it was so wrong to want to be with this girl and want to protect her. I asked her how her parents felt about these feelings. She said her dad thought she was going through a phase, but for her, these feelings were so real and so powerful that she wasn't too sure what to do with them, especially as she wanted to follow Christ. As we chatted, I explained that we can still trust God, even in that situation. Her feelings were important, but we need to trust God's good design. Yet, even as I talked to her, I couldn't help but be moved. You see, she was Filipino, just like me. This caught me by surprise because I didn't expect other immigrants to be in that small rural community. Yet here she was dealing with the very same cultural and family struggles I faced too. Through her, I could imagine what it would be like for my family if I began to talk about my own same sex attractions. Growing up in an Asian family, we never talk about sex, let alone gay sex. Homosexuality is a sign of weakness in my culture. Gay men are unmasculine, gay women are the opposite. Even the word for gay in Filipino, bakla, is said with derision and disappointment. But I wasn't ready to share this about me with her because I never wanted to be that. I wanted to let her know that she wasn't alone. I wanted her to know that even Christian apologists who defend the faith professionally can also struggle with the same questions she now had as someone on her own faith journey. I even understood what it was like to deeply care for a same sex friend and wonder if what I felt was romantic love. Of all the things I wish I could have said to her, the one thing she probably needed to hear the most was the temptations in your life are no different from what others experience. 1 Corinthians 10:13. And I was living proof of that. But I was so fearful of bringing up my own struggles, I only gave her generic advice that never mentioned my own attractions. I had not considered how my own experience could make a difference in her life and the others' life like her. As I drove home from that talk, I felt convicted by the Lord that I was not done speaking on this issue. He acknowledged how I felt. I didn't want to talk about homosexuality because it's such a personal issue. Speaking of my experience makes me vulnerable to the judgments of others and has led to awkward situations that you'll read more about in this book. Worse, I face a myriad of unknowns. What would people think of me? Would they only see me as an effeminate man who lost his masculinity? How would they treat me? Would I just be seen as a sexual category? Would I lose credibility as a Christian apologist among my friends and peers? What would my family think? On the other hand, I also knew that God often brings his people through situations in order to help others. As the author of Hebrews writes, the nation of Israel faced such hardship for our benefit. He says, these things happen to them as examples for us. They are written down to warn us who live at the end of the age. God was showing me that because I had to face this issue personally, I actually had insight that even some of our best Christian leaders couldn't have. This experience could help young men and women like the Filipino I met at that small rural church. Maybe letting people like her know that Christians like me exist will help them face their own struggles. More importantly, and we're almost done here, God reminded me of my talk. If real love does not give us license to do what we wish, then I couldn't just ignore the issue because I didn't want to talk about it. Real love looks to meet the needs of those around us. In fact, as I consider that conversation now, I see how that young woman's struggle represents so much of where the church is at today. Whole denominations are wrestling with what to do with their emotions over these issues. They don't know who to turn to for help. Sadly, some have rejected God's design, good design for sexuality, and have embraced a view of sexuality and gender that revises Jesus' teachings to suit their moral views. Just as this young woman wanted love, many of these churches just want to love people. Yet love for them means endorsing any sexual behavior or identity. It also means embracing the idea that our sexual attractions form the most important part of our identity. They do not understand that the biblical view of love rejoices with the truth of God's commands. 1 Corinthians 13:6. As well, just like that young woman, those who do want to hold on to a biblical view of sexuality are confused about what to do. They have had little instruction, even from church leadership, about how to struggle with their feelings. A couple more paragraphs. I start with this anecdote so you can see that we all struggle with conversations on sexuality and gender. It's not easy to answer the questions of well meaning people who may not agree with the biblical worldview. But that's not all we're facing. Christian parents come to me asking how to react when their own children demand they use preferred pronouns or when their Christian school promotes Pride Month. Our culture has made sexuality and now gender identity the defining issue of the day. It's in our entertainment, our sidewalks, our schools. In fact, endorsing a biblical worldview has led to losing your job and even led to friends of mine losing their church building. Meanwhile, rejecting a biblical worldview can be very profitable and lead you to funding and fame. It seems increasingly easier to capitulate to culture and do what they want, or even worse, say nothing at all as if these issues aren't important to God. However, I also share this story because I was challenged on my drive back from that church. I thought about the life giving truths about sexuality and gender God has given his people. How can we stay silent? How could I be silent? That's why I'm writing this book. So that's the introduction. Hopefully, that was an interesting part of it. And I want to, as you can see, not just write a theology book, not just write an autobiography book, but really tie both of those in together. I'll mention later on one of the points that I realized is a lot of the great books out there, some of the best people on this topic, the people I look up to, often they write one book about their autobiography and then they do another book about their theology. And I'd really like to see if I could do both, because I think the challenge as an apologist in this generation is to be able to show that apologetics is not just an intellectual thing, it's something we live out, and it's something that we can share from our own personal experience. And frankly, God says that. The scriptures say that our stories, our autobiographies are God's way of teaching others about Him, about His Word, about His teaching, and also showing that we can live these commands out. And especially for this generation, that need for autobiography is so important in how we talk about faith. So I hope that's a beginning. And again, that's we're about half an hour or so, but I hope this has been helpful for you to see that where I'm at, to understand that I'm plugging along. We're going to do another one if this is popular, as I said, and I want to make sure you know that you are welcome as my donors and friends to keep asking questions, help me understand what's going on in terms of what you think, maybe give some advice, but at the very least, to be able to know that this is a project that I want to make sure that is going to be available as soon as possible to those who need it. And so, if you can continue to pray for me, want to support me, as I said in my last email, that I sent out. I haven't done any talks or many talks. I've done a few like local talks for my church, that kind of stuff, in the summer, and I won't be doing many talks again next month because I'm continuing to write. But obviously, I do need to be able to raise a living, and I'm starting to book talks in the fall. So that's going to be starting to happen. But the more support I can raise during this time, the less presentations and time I need to take off to do work. So my hope is by the end of the fall, by the end of the summer, fall, I'll be able to submit what I've written to my editor, get that going, and hopefully by the beginning of next year, you will have a hard copy or a soft copy, hopefully probably a soft copy of the book in your hands. So that's my prayer. That's what I'm working towards, everyone, and that's what I would ask you to keep praying for me to get this book done that way. So once again, thanks for joining me today. Hopefully that was a good introduction for you for the book. I'll be reading another segment of the book again. If there's a desire for that, let me know. I'm more than happy to hear from you. God bless you, and thanks for keeping me keeping connected and keeping me in your prayers. God bless you. Take care.